Things have changed. I feel that if you look at somebody like Coltrane's son, Ravi, who's a band leader and a good one, and who does not sound like his father, if you look at him as sort of a typical new band leader with a working band in jazz, and more or less what's called straight-ahead jazz or mainstream jazz, he's taking in a lot of different things. There's some free playing in there. There's some, very learned stuff. A lot of emphasis on structure, Latin rhythm, a lot of things superimposed, and existing together quite well. Whereas it was a little harder to find that 10 years ago, and a lot harder to find that 20 years ago. And so the kind of like blanketing influence of Coltrane is not what it was when I first started thinking about writing this book. Mm. I think things have improved.
Well, the whole way jazz is, in society now, I mean, there's this sort of institutionalization of it that is on the one hand, which I think in the book you mentioned is sort of an odd approach to Coltrane's, when you try to institutionalize it as like kind of put it on the pedestal, or I guess that's sort of not as prevalent. Maybe I might be wrong, but it seems to me it for a while there it was like the big thing going, and now there's a little more going on outside of that.
Outside of institutionalization?
Yeah, I mean, some of the universities, the programs aren't quite as, rigid maybe.
Well, that seems true. Yes, that seems true. Jazz pedagogy is not as rigid as it used to be. It's very wide open. It takes in a lot more than it used to 10, 20 years ago. I think when Jazz at Lincoln Center set up, and the idea of jazz institutions playing jazz repertory became prevalent, I think people focused on that, ad nauseum, because it was such a strikingly kind of weird idea. So this music that's all about improvisation, now there's an academy there's a certain way that you're supposed to play it. What are you supposed to replicate, old solos like it's classical music? Is this now a written music, an archival? Well, no, not really. I mean, Jazz at Lincoln Center and the Smithsonian and other people who were doing it had their own solutions to those problems. What they were more concerned with was just somehow keeping this music played and keeping listeners familiar with the way certain things sound on stage. The great I think the great gift of a place like Jazz at Lincoln Center is that they can play a Duke Ellington arrangement or a Count Basie arrangement and give you some notion of what that music was all about, because you get to hear it in a big room, played well. You can hear the way the parts of the arrangement bounce around the stage. Like, you get it in a way that you can't quite get it from listening to records.
Right.
I happen to have a much more performance-oriented understanding of jazz, and that's what I'm really interested in. I think that records only tell a little bit of the story, and it's in performance where things really happen.
Well, interestingly, it seems like things are coming back around to that now, because in part the record industry and its travails, its problems and things that are going on, you hear more and more performers in all the different music areas saying it's all about the performances now and merchandising.
It is. I just wish that there were enough places booking jazz in an informal way to sustain working bands, because there are lots of places around
New York,
little clubs or restaurants or whatever that are hiring jazz groups and jazz performers, for sure. But it's not quite enough. With Coltrane, if you look at his itinerary, in the 50s and 60s, you see two things. You see, especially in the 60s, you see weeks on end at a single place.
Right.
In New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Philadelphia. And that's quite amazing. And that's where bands really become great. But also, when he's just a journeyman saxophone player playing with all kinds of different groups in the 50s, you see him playing in towns in the United States that you've never heard of, towns with funny names, that third, fourth, fifth tier towns. Right. Like every little town had a kind of like a roadhouse, or maybe these were towns near a railroad track, and had one bar or something. So things were different. I'm not saying that one-nighters are good for the health of musicians or for their economic well-being. It's a terrible way to live, actually, is doing one night after another and traveling all over the country. But I'm just saying that work was really plentiful. Mm-hmm. And as I was saying before, I believe that jazz is entirely about gigs. The history of jazz is about gigs. That's what it comes down to, and it's gigs that make bands great.
And the way that economically things are now, a lot of places don't pay enough for bands to really live. I mean, you kind of have to have a second job, be really professional, or be a trust fund person to be able to be a jazz musician, unless you are lucky and talented enough and get out there enough to sustain yourself.
Well, if you get to a very good level of being a jazz band leader, what you will do in this country is play this circuit of sort of mid-sized theaters, university arts centers or whatever. And it's a nice circuit, and it's pretty well developed right now, but it's not enough. Mm-hmm. It's just not enough. You play one show one night in a town, and then you go to another state to play a gig a week later. And by the way, tickets cost $20 or $30, and students aren't quite sure whether they want to go. The whole thing is just a little bit off. And then, yes, as you said, the record industry, there is no jazz record industry anymore. Blue Note still exists, and once in a while is signing somebody interesting, but basically it's a huge amount of self-produced things, and the craft of record making has gone down so far, so fast in the last 15 years that it's really incredible. This has to do with money, this has to do with technology, but it also has to do with craft. Mm-hmm. So records are even less important than ever now. I mean, I think they always were kind of imperfect in showing you what jazz was really all about, but the whole record thing is more complicated than it ever was.
And it doesn't really seem to me like much of a download art form.
In one sense, it's not, because pop music is unbelievably better at making its point right away. Yeah. Making its point in a song right away. Jazz, a great deal of jazz is more about being patient, waiting the thing out. This track might take 10 minutes, and that's just less powerful with MP3s and MySpace pages, and you don't get that quick hit so fast.
Yeah, and they're pretty compressed, the sound, aren't they?
That's true too, yeah.
Different sound, speaking of sound, so...
Yeah.